Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Toronto, Canada on December 1st, 2025 for Reason to Resist. CNN reports that 30 minutes from now, US President Donald Trump will hold a meeting at the White House about next steps on Venezuela. Key members of Trump's cabinet and national security team, including Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dan Kane, I should say, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio are expected to attend, as well as White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles and Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. The meeting comes as the Trump regime has increased pressure on Venezuela by bombing civilian vessels near the Venezuelan coast and amassing more than a dozen warships and 15,000 troops in the region as part of what the Pentagon has branded Operation Southern Spear. Trump also said last week that the U.S. would be stopping Venezuelan drug trafficking by land in addition to by sea very soon. Over the weekend on social media, Trump warned airlines to avoid Venezuelan airspace, evidently believing that he has the authority to declare a no-fly zone over the territory of a sovereign country. Finally, according to a Reason to Resist source who formerly worked in U.S. intelligence, an operation that he called Operation Lights Out is now underway. And according to the source, U.S. forces are deployed in Venezuela, and they have the codes for airstrikes both from air and sea assets. Now, here to discuss all of this with us is Ajamu Baraka. Ajamu is an American political activist, and in 2016, he was the Green Party nominee for Vice President of the United States on the ballot in 45 states and received nearly 1.5 million votes. Ajamu currently serves as the national organizer and spokesperson for the Black Alliance for Peace. Thank you very much for coming back onto the program, Ajamu.
And thank you so much for having me. One quick sort of a correction. I'm no longer the national coordinator for the Black Alliance of Peace. I am the director of its North-South Project for People-Centered Human Rights. We have a new outstanding chair, Jacqueline Lugman, and we have three outstanding young activists who are taking up the responsibility of continuing with the organization of this very, very important formation.
Thank you for that clarification, and it's wonderful to hear that the Black Alliance for Peace is going strong. It is an incredibly important voice in the political landscape in the United States. So I'd like to begin by asking for your assessment of the political situation in Washington vis-a-vis these threats against the Venezuelan nation. There are plenty of reasons to believe, I would say, that Trump will launch some sort of direct attack on Venezuelan territory. He might, of course, be bluffing, but given his demonstrated propensity for extreme violence, it would be unwise of us to assume that this is all just posturing. And with a real danger of a war on Venezuela, do you see any real opposition in Congress to this aggression from any quarter? And if so, who is putting up that resistance?
Well, that's a good question because there's been some concerns expressed around the range of authority that Trump has to engage in these actions, specifically the attacks on the boats that they claim to be drug couriers, but many people argue are mainly basically fishing vessels. Um, and there's concerns about political concerns about the extent to which a direct attack on Venezuela has any kind of legal weight, whether or not the authorizations to use military force um, really applies here, even when you then connect that to the issue of drugs, and then arbitrarily deciding that this non-existent uh, cartel is responsible for the transshipping of drugs from Venezuela to the U.S., and that the president of Venezuela is in fact the head of this cartel, therefore becoming a national security threat to the U.S. All of these are questions that people have. There are people in the progressive caucus raising questions, and even there are questions in the Republican Party people like Rand Paul and others who are raising questions about the legality and, in fact, the morality of these attacks. I think many people recognize that on the heels of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, that the U.S. Has directly facilitated, and now with these kinds of reckless, lawless activities, that the U.S. standing, the prestige of this country, has taken a beating, and that the possibility of ever using quote unquote soft power to advance U.S. global interests is now being severely undermined, in fact, diminished to extent that it's almost irreversible. So there are concerns, Dimitri, but the concerns aren't really loud enough. We know that there are activists, the anti-war coalitions, the anti-war organizations have been attempting to mobilize to help people to understand the threat that this poses for the region and for the continued normalization of war. But in my opinion, the opposition is not strong enough. There has not been sufficient outrage at this kind of gangsterism that we see now emanating from this government.
Mhm. I'm glad you mentioned, uh, the global implications of all of this and how all of this events elsewhere may be impacting what is happening in the Caribbean. It seems, Ajamu, to me that um, Trump's level of aggression towards Venezuela is almost in inverse proportion to the fate of the Ukrainian military, as Russia has advanced further and further into areas controlled by the Ukrainian military, and the collapse or possible collapse of the Ukrainian military has accelerated. He's becoming increasingly belligerent towards Venezuela. Do you think there's a relationship between what is happening in the Caribbean, the Trump regime's attitude and posture towards Venezuela, and what is happening elsewhere in the world, particularly not only in Ukraine but also in West Asia?
But there's definitely a connection. Whether or not this is sort of a diversionary kind of action, it remains to be seen. I think it does reflect, though, the the dependency on the use of structure of violence of state violence to advance political objectives, and the normalization of that process. Um, the Trump administration is bogged down now in Ukraine, as you implied in your question. But I think that the situation in Venezuela is very different, and this is what I mean by that. Even though we have this assertion of military force of U.S. power in our region, in the Americas, in some ways it represents less of a assertion of a confident and powerful state than one that is in fact fragile. That uh, a state that recognizes that its ability to dictate its interests and to advance its interests, and states would fall in line to allow for the U.S. to advance its interests, even sometimes at their own peril. That era is changing, and that the ability to exercise power in a unipolar way is over. And with the emergence of various other pockets of power, coalitions of powerful states, that there's a recognition that if the U.S. is going to maintain its ability to influence global structures, to influence global issues, that it needs to shore up itself in the Americas region. I see the Trump belligerence off the coast of Venezuela as just that, an attempt to consolidate its power in the Western Hemisphere, to ensure that it can maintain a degree of control in light of the inroads being made by what they perceive to be their global adversaries, primarily the Russians, but specifically the Chinese. in which the Chinese right now, I mean, many of the country's main trading partners now, our relationship is now with more so with China than even with the U.S. So this is a strategic move, I think, to assert leadership, to assert control in the region, and Venezuela is key. If you control and contain Venezuela, and then you are able to contain and control the politics in this region to a certain extent. You can increase the pressure, the isolation of Cuba. You can continue to undermine Nicaragua. You can continue to put pressure on all of the states and even movements in the region that have alternative ways of looking at how society should be organized. So the entire thrust of radical politics in the Americas, a thrust that I would argue represents some of the most advanced, progressive, and radical politics on the planet. That this the collapse, not the collapse, but the destruction of the Venezuelan state, if it could happen, would be a significant victory for those forces of reaction and for the U.S. attempting to maintain some degree of regional and global power.
Let's talk for a moment about the strength, the ability of the Venezuelan state to resist this aggression. In October, the New York Times reported that Venezuelan officials, hoping to diffuse tensions with Trump, offered to the Trump regime a dominant stake in Venezuela's oil and other mineral wealth in discussions that lasted for months. And the New York Times report was based, said the Times, on interviews with more than a dozen American and Venezuelan representatives of disparate factions. That's the phrase it used, calling for diplomacy with President Maduro. They described their discussions on condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly, or so they said. So, in other words, not one of the sources was willing to go on record. What do you make of this New York Times report, Ajamu? Do you, knowing what you do about the Maduro government, about the Chavismo movement, about Venezuela, do you regard it as credible that President Maduro offered basically a dominant position to the Trump administration in Venezuela's all important oil sector?
Mm. I think it's quite unlikely. I would assume that in the course of these conversations, that various things were put on the table. But I think that the Bolivarian process is a process in which there are forces beyond Maduro that would not have gone along with any kind of agreement that would have severely undermined the sovereignty of Venezuela and brought into disrepute the Bolivarian process. So, no, I don't give these conversations much credibility. I mean, especially when you understand the role of the New York Times and the ideological sort of objectives of attempting to undermine the integrity of the process of the Bolivarian process, to demoralize those forces inside the country and outside that are still attempting to support the Venezuelan people. So no, I don't think that that is something that was seriously considered. But again, I think that in the process of his commitment to dialogue, that all kinds of things were put out there, and I suspect that some of those things were put out there were then extracted, abstracted from the context and used in the way that we saw in that article.
So, as I indicated at the outset, Trump has strongly indicated that U.S. forces will, by land, not simply by sea, seek to interdict the flow of the alleged flow of drugs from Venezuela to the United States. Um, and knowing what you do about the commitment of the Venezuelan people to the Bolivarian project, how do you think uh, the population is likely to react? I know this is a difficult sort of thing to assess and predict, but how the population is likely to react to the insertion of U.S. forces on the sovereign territory of Venezuela for the purpose of overthrowing the government of Nicolas Maduro.
The population of Venezuela is something like 28.5 million people. It is a large nation, and it is part of a regional history in which resistance to Yankee imperialism, if you will, has been part of its sort of DNA. So the insertion of U.S. troops on the ground in Venezuela will not only inflame the situation within that country, but throughout the region. The forces that are now in the Caribbean, 15,000, it's reported 15,000 troops. That's not enough to invade and to hold the country. It's enough to maybe take Caracas, force the government out of Caracas, fly Maria Machado in and put her in the palace, the presidential palace, and pretend you have a new government. But even that will be difficult based on what appears to be significant capabilities now on the part of the Venezuelan government to protect its airspace. Um, this, for example, the assertion by Donald Trump of a no-fly zone even caught the Pentagon by surprise because when you attempt to put in place the conditions for a no-fly zone, that's basically a declaration of war because it means that you have to do certain things in order to enforce the no-fly zone. You have to knock out the radar of the nation. You have to disable, destroy its air defense systems, which means you have to attack them. Okay, so uh, that is the kinds of support that they have gotten from various states have a lot provided them the ability to be able to a certain extent, protect their airspace. So this is not going to be the cakewalk that people like Elliot Abrams have argued that if you just do a decapitation of the leadership, then the state will dissolve. No, it's when you have such a process like this, and you've had now a generation and a half of a revolutionary process, and you have a state that has survived after 99% of its oil revenues were disappeared or stolen, if you will, undermined by these sanctions, where the people have endured these years of sanctions, and the state and the process has continued, then you can almost could be assured that if there was the insertion of U.S. troops on the ground, it'll be a significant opposition. But everybody recognizes that that would be a disaster for the Venezuelan people, but also for the U.S. because it would bog the U.S. down in a conflict that even when they have war gamed the conflict out, they have recognized that it would be chaotic and uncontrollable, and that it would be basically the U.S. bogging itself down once again in a never-ending military conflict.
So you raised the issue of other states supporting Venezuela and its sovereign right to defend its territory. In November, Alexei Zhuravlev, who was the first deputy chairman of the Russian State Duma Defense Committee, told Russian media that, quote, Russian Pantsir S-1 and Buk M2E systems were just recently delivered to Caracas by Il-76 transport aircraft. So you have here, and he's not the only Russian official who has said things of that nature. So you have official declarations of Russian politicians that Venezuela is receiving significant air defense aid from the Russian Federation. China, at least rhetorically, has stood by Venezuela, and right from the going back many years, and affirmed its support for President Maduro after the most recent election. It's also purported to be, the largest foreign investor at a state level in Venezuela. So one would think, based upon all of this and other factors, that Russia and China are likely to in some manner, if they haven't already, will support Venezuela in the face of any overt and direct aggression by the United States government. But at the same time, Ajamu, a lot of us were quite disappointed by what happened at the UN Security Council a couple of weeks ago, when neither Russia nor China vetoed that abominable Resolution 2803, which effectively appointed Donald Trump as the CEO of the Gaza Strip. The genocidal lunatic was put in charge of the crime site. Now, to be fair to Russia and China, of course, they did not vote for the resolution. They abstained and they criticized it. And of course, they don't bear primary responsibility for the arming of Israel. But I think some of us, for that and other reasons, wonder, if push comes to shove, how much support can Venezuela actually rely upon from the People's Republic of China and Russia? What is your feeling about that? How do you think, realistically speaking, the governments of Russia and China are likely to respond in the case of a direct military intervention by the United States in Venezuela?
I think the response that they are going to provide, they've already provided in terms of some of the things that you already alluded to, the military weapons equipment that's been transshipped to the country, the advisors that we know have been in the country and are still in the country. We suspect that some of those advisors are also providing specialized security for the president of Venezuela. But if there, in fact, is the beginning of a shooting war beyond raising this issue within the confines of the Security Council, we can't expect to see any kind of direct military intervention on the part of those two states. Remember now, this is a situation that is thousands of miles from their respective countries. Um, so, in essence, the people of Venezuela will be on their own. But I think that there's a recognition on the part of both the Chinese and the Russians, finally, that they're not dealing with rational actors in the U.S. That every bit of concessions you might give to the U.S., hoping that it could be the basis for some type of rational, sustainable agreement that can result in peace, some degree of stability, has been demonstrated that that's not the case. That the U.S. has decided that is going to either win or is going to create conditions that are threatening the very existence of all of us. And so a more resolute, firm resistance to the U.S. Is required. And so uh, I think it's been demonstrated and communicated to the U.S. by, for example, the Chinese that the agreement that it had with Venezuela to begin to process is heavy crude. I mean, to the extent that they built some plants in China for that, was directly connected to, in my opinion, to the conversation and the resulting decision on the part of the Chinese to impose restrictions on rare earth materials to the U.S. You see, the Chinese don't engage in public diplomacy like the U.S. does. But for me, the timing of how that unfolded was very, very interesting. Now we don't know, of course, pure speculation on my part, but I can see those kinds of connections. So beyond that kind of response, beyond that kind of pressure, if there is a military conflict, I think unfortunately for the Venezuelans, it would be themselves, the people, against the empire, and other. Well, what will happen? I can almost predict this. There will be forces from throughout the region that will make their way to Venezuela from the Americas to provide real direct military assistance to the people in Venezuela. And the more wise um, uh, analysts in the U.S. Foreign policy community, they understand that. And that's part of their concern. That basically, if you insert the U.S. directly into this conflict, there would be no getting out very quickly. You look at the terrain, you look at the history, and it is a quagmire. and something that the more wiser heads are saying, do not open up that door.
Mhm. I'm curious in particular what you anticipate we would see from the government of Lula in Brazil in the case of a U.S. direct military intervention. Lula, I think it's fair to say, has expressed his opposition to any kind of a military threat to Venezuela, any attempt to overthrow the Maduro government by force. But at the same time, Lula, when I was in Venezuela during the election, the last election as an observer, uh, at the invitation of the Socialist Party of Venezuela, when the results were announced, Lula was quite equivocal in terms of his support for the electoral processes and didn't come out strongly either for or against in terms of supporting the official result. At the same time, I think he's made clear, at least rhetorically, his opposition to any kind of military intervention by the United States in Venezuela. And I personally have no doubt that that's sincere. He really strongly opposes that. But in a practical sense, what do you think we're likely to see from the Brazilian government if push comes to shove?
Of course, it'd be condemned. There's no question about that. It's part of the history of resistance to Yankee imperialism. But beyond that, um, it remains to be seen in terms of how the resistance unfolds in Venezuela. Remember now that Venezuela also has a border with Brazil,
Mhm.
and so that those borders with Colombia and Brazil provide fallback spaces for any kind of internal Venezuelan resistance movement, if you will. And so we would see then how much support to that resistance might come from Brazil. So, but again, that even this conversation really, I think reveals how much chaos and destabilization would occur if the U.S. was to, in fact, attempt to intervene physically into Venezuela. Um, and so, again, I suspect that what is going to happen in terms of U.S. military activity after they have brought together this truly impressive and lethal military force off the coast of Venezuela, uh, to sail away without some kind of indication that it was worth it would be seen as a failure, and it would be ridiculed internationally. It'd be connected to the failure to engage in a regime change when you had the fake Juan Guaido presidency. So I suspect that it'd be a situation somewhat similar to what we had when the U.S. attacked Iran. That more symbolic than effective, even though the Trump administration pretends otherwise. And so I suspect there will be some kind of bombing of some kind of facilities in Brazil, I mean, not in Venezuela,
Mhm.
and then they will claim success. But to introduce troops on the ground in Venezuela would be a disaster. Even a temporary introduction and trying to hold the capital of Caracas would be very, very challenging.
Yeah, that chaos that would inevitably result, I think, one of the impacts of that would be that there's likely to be a massive outflow of desperate migrants from Venezuela. We've already seen massive outflows because of the impoverishment of the country due to sanctions. And so one should anticipate, I would think, that if in fact this region descends into chaos as a result of a direct military aggression, you're going to see a lot more Venezuelans trying to enter into the United States. And it's remarkable how the very same people who seem in American politics to be most hostile to these migrants uh, are the most supportive of the American government's imperialistic foreign policies. I'm wondering, Ajamu, from where you sit, do you think people in the United States are starting more and more to make the connection between U.S. foreign policy, the imperialistic practices of the U.S. government, and domestic impacts, and particularly, for example, illegal immigration? Do you think they're making that connection and they're starting to understand that these military aggressions are a major cause of many people from the global south trying to enter the United States illegally? Or do you think that they remain sort of in a state of denial about all of that?
Well, I think that there is a budding consciousness among people in the U.S. making all kinds of connections, including the connection between the activity of the U.S. state and its economic interests in these various countries and the resulting inflows of migration. But they're also understanding, too, that they cannot really understand their plight in the U.S. The fact that 40% of the working class in the U.S. Is considered to be poor, uh, that they won't understand why you see such viciousness coming from the police forces, and now these ICE forces that even MAGA forces are really beginning to oppose because of their brutality. That they're beginning to understand that when you have this kind of concentrated wealth, and even a Trump administration that pretends that is for the people and against the globalists, but once they take power, you see that they pursue policies that reinforce the quote unquote globalist agenda in advancing the economic interests of a elite element of the capitalist class. They are beginning to see and believe that they may have been gaslighted. That basically, these structures are all interconnected, and that they're not going to be able to deal with their concerns, their issues, while without better understanding the concerns and issues that other people face in the world, and in particular in the Americas. So these kinds of connections are being made. In fact, these are the kind of connections that we have to try to facilitate being made as part of the political opposition. This is the work that we engage in from the Black Alliance for Peace, working with other organizations and helping people to understand the terms of their lives and really the terms of struggle. Because basically, what we're seeing with this these moves off the coast of Venezuela, with what happened a week and a half ago in the Security Council, with the militarization of the police forces uh, and ICE, with the continuation of mass incarceration within the U.S., with the expansion of the military commands throughout the world, we're seeing a desperation. We're seeing a commitment to the only reform that the ruling class seems to have at this point in order to maintain itself, and that is the reform of fascism. And people need to understand that fascism is a capitalist reform. Okay, it is, and so the vote in the Security Council, in my opinion, a week and a half ago, demonstrated that the kind of fascist consolidation taking place within the empire itself, within the U.S., is now being duplicated with international structures and institutions. With the Security Council basically surrendering the UN Charter, surrendering its principles, undermining international law itself, going back to the days of the League of Nations with the mandate system, basically giving to Israel and the United States of the territory of Gaza and the West Bank to a certain extent. This is absolutely outrageous, but it reflects the fascist takeover of these post-war institutions. So we are in a phase of global fascism, and people don't seem to understand that because they've been so warped and corrupted by these bad Hitler movies. They don't understand that fascism is a reflection of class relationships. Okay, the merger of the most powerful elements of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, and the state. And so when we have this oligarchic power, in the U.S. Now, the seat of the international bourgeoisie, if you will, it is asserting itself internationally, you know, and it has made a decision that basically either it's going to continue and expand itself, or it's going to blow the entire world up. I mean, this is the psychopathology of white supremacy. This is the psychopathology of an element that's been in power too long, and is undermining itself with its own internal contradictions. So this is a very dangerous period, and people need to understand that. That's why when we look at the particular situation with Venezuela, we have to try to put that in context, try to understand what this means in terms of the region and the planet with these kinds of moves, and understand that basically, if we don't have the ability to have alternative power, people power, based with or backed up with a few progressive states, uh, we're not going to be able to put a brake on these forces. And we can't put a brake on these irrational and dangerous forces. Again, I make the argument that we are facing an existential threat.
I want to step back for a second and ask you about fascism because it's a subject that is a topic that is arising increasingly in our discourse in the independent media, the alternative media, and amongst voices on the left. But I don't think we talk often enough about what we mean when we say fascism. I want to invite you to share with us what you mean by that term. What do you take to be the principal features of fascism, and why do you believe that this is entrenching itself in the centers of power, both domestically and internationally?
Let me answer that by sort of laying out my understanding or my view of two forms of fascism, interconnected. Um, the character is basically the same, but they manifest themselves in different ways. You might recall that one of the critiques of the 1930s from many of the people of color from the left, people like Du Bois, um, George Padmore, Amy Cesar, uh, all said that basically what we had in the 1930s with the rise of first Mussolini and then the Nazis in Germany was the importation of colonial fascism into the center, into the metropoles. That basically, in the colonial so-called peripheries, that the very development, the very evolution of that relationship, that empire building on the part of Europeans, was fascistic in the sense that basically it was based on the absolute and total dehumanization and degradation of the colonial populations. It was based on a predatory form of colonial capitalism. It extracted value from the resources and the labor and the very lives of the people in the colonies, with the values being transferred back to to the centers. But for the people themselves, there was no democracy. There was complete coordination between the private economic forces and the colonial states. In the 1930s, in the midst of the capitalist crisis, those kinds of conditions were imported back into Western Europe. The abandonment of liberal democracy, the merging of the state and the private sector, the capitalist sector, the surrendering, if you will, of much of a degree of the power that capitalists have to these petty bourgeois-led political movements in Italy and in Germany. Okay, uh, with the result of the Second World War, but not the end of fascism. Fascism was temporarily defeated in Western Europe. But people have to be reminded that with the defeat of Italy and Germany, you still have fascist government in Portugal. You still have a fascist government in Spain. Okay, and then you had the attempt on the part of the colonialists to try to recoup themselves in the colonies. And what did they do? They reverted back to the colonial practices. They went back, and you had the French engaging in horrific repression in Algeria, in Vietnam. You had the British with the attacking the people of Kenya, Rhodesia, South Africa, the attempt to maintain the colonies in Southern Africa. I mean, you had fascism being repracticed again, if you will, in the colonies. So now what we have the crisis of the 2007-2008, the most severe capitalist crisis since the 1930s. Is more than a coincidence that a consequence of that period was one of the most aggressive U.S. administration in post-war history under the Obama administration. It wasn't just a coincidence. This was the reaction. This was laying the foundation for the reconsolidation of a fascist reform to this crisis. Moving and making sure that you had your forces in place in places like Honduras. So you support a coup in Egypt, in Libya. Uh, you know, this is you deny the movement for human rights in Bahrain. You embrace the Saudis. This is you take you embrace the Saudis, and you unleash a war in Yemen. There's a 2,400% expansion of the 1033 program in the United States of America. 1033 program being the program to transfer military grade equipment from the military to the police forces. It's a 1,900% expansion of the U.S. Africa Command. Okay, so this lays the foundation for where we are today with the neo-fascism consolidation that's taking place under the Trump administration. Everything that the Trump administration did, the foundation was laid under Obama and under Biden. So yeah, so neo-fascism is the reform process we are presently grappling with, and people need to understand that there's not going to be any response, any effective response, from the neoliberal Democrats. I've been making an argument for almost 8 years that the cutting edge of the new forms of fascism in the U.S. was, in fact, emanating from neoliberal Democrats. Neoliberalism is a form of fascism. That's why it was first imposed where? In Chile in 1973. Okay?
Mhm.
So these are the kinds of conceptual and analytical frames we need to understand and grapple with if we're going to understand and grapple with the current challenges we face today. If not, we're going to be confused. We're going to be trying to psychoanalyze individuals, not understanding the objective class forces at play.
So
Hope that
since you're
wasn't
on
too
the
much.
no, I think that was extremely important to say. Since you're on the, you raised the subject of confusion. I have to confess that I was quite confused when I learned yesterday that Trump has said he will pardon the former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted of drug trafficking charges in a U.S. court last year. Hernandez was found guilty in March of 2024 of conspiring to import cocaine into the U.S. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison. And Trump said Hernandez had been, quote, treated very harshly and unfairly, close quote, in a social media post announcing the move on Friday. Um, I'll try not to be facetious here, Ajamu, but do you think that Hernandez was treated very unfairly and harshly by the so-called U.S. justice system?
Well, he wasn't treated as harshly as those individuals who are supposedly engaged in drug trafficking off the coast of Venezuela, who were blown apart. And so it really demonstrates how ridiculous this whole notion that the Trump administration is concerned about drug trafficking in Venezuela. Everybody knows that this is about Venezuelan oil. Not only Venezuela, but also Guyana. See, Guyana doesn't understand that basically that their ability to maintain any kind of degree of sovereignty is almost over, and especially if the U.S. is able to impose itself in Venezuela. This is all about the oil. It's about the oil and the diamonds and the emeralds and the copper and in the country. You know, this is what made the West the West. See, one of the things that we should be a little bit grateful for in terms of what happened with Gaza and what's happening now with Venezuela and other examples is that we're now seeing in real time and graphic images what made the West the West. That basically it was colonial genocide. It was the rape and plunder of peoples and their resources. You know, it was the gangsterism we see now with the move to basically gangster of Venezuelan oil. Okay, so this is what we up against. This notion that there was any kind of connection between the security frame and so-called liberal values is all it was BS from the very beginning. The values are the values we see today off the coast of Venezuela, in Gaza. It is these are the Western values of colonial plunder, of colonial fascism, okay, of denying democracy and denying peoplehood, of basically having two sets of people: people who have rights that should be respected and recognized, and the non-humans that are then subjected to 2 years of genocide, of bombings and rape and murders and torture. And now everybody's like everything is fine. So no, this is what made the West the West, and this is why now they're concerned about the so-called global South, or as Trump said, the third world, because the resistance to the continuation of these relationships are emanating from the global South, from the third world. And when we see these kind of moves being made off the coast of Venezuela, all that does is to steal us even more in our understanding of what needs to be done, our recognition of who the real enemy is, our understanding of what needs to be done in terms of how we liberate ourselves and build a new world. And that means we come to the conclusion that basically we can't survive at the same time that these forces are allowed to survive. That it's going to be either them or us. That is, these are the terms, and people need to understand that. There's no appealing to their good conscience or to reason. These people understand one element, and that one element is force. And we want to live in peace, but we recognize that in order to live in peace, we have to defeat those forces responsible for the chaos, for the murder, for the degradation and dehumanization of most of humanity on this planet. And we name those forces: colonialism, neo-colonialism, um, imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy. We name those structural forces that all work together and conspire against us. And we don't apologize about the fact that we see ourselves as a revolutionary force, and that the only way we're going to be able to build a new world is when we, in fact, defeat those forces.
Amen to that. So I have one last question to ask you on this whole question of drug interdiction and the war on drugs. I remember when I was a kid, going back quite some time now, when I was a young man, teenager, that's when all this talk about the war on drugs really began. I think there was a lot of this kind of discussion, as I recall, in the Reagan administration, Bob Dole and all those characters. And then after, uh, I don't know, 20, 30 years of the militarization of, drug interdiction efforts, there was open discussion in the corporate media and the so-called mainstream about the failure of the war on drugs, right? And then so people were talking about that, and it wasn't controversial to say in the corporate media and in mainstream political discourse that the war on drugs had failed. And then that all of a sudden that just kind of disappeared in the last 10 years. People stopped talking about that. So my question to you is this, Ajamu, and I'd like to end our discussion here because so much of the discussion at the level of the corporate media has been focused upon the drug war or the war on drugs. If Trump were actually serious about dealing with, uh, narcotics addiction and the drug trade in the United States, or any president, whoever it may be, what kind of policy program would, in your opinion, it be necessary to pursue? What would be an effective strategy to deal with this problem?
Decriminalize drugs. But they don't want to do that. They don't want to do that because you have a international drug trade that has a value of something like $650 billion. Okay. It would collapse the bourgeois banks. Okay. But this is not even, but like you said, this is not even about drugs. It's not about crime. These are instruments they have used in order to advance specific interests. Because if they were concerned about narcotics, then we wouldn't have had a situation that we had in my communities in the 1980s with the flooding of our communities with what crack cocaine, and we come to find out that one of the reasons why that was happening was that there was a flood of cocaine coming in from Central America that was allowed to be imported into our communities with the agreement that these planes coming in and bringing in crack from Central America and other places were then going back where Nicaragua. This was how they funded the Contra War. This is how the U.S. funded the Contra War. Was broken by, remember, Gary Webb. Okay,
Mhm.
so this has been a weapon they've used. They did the same thing, in the 1960s. Air America, that was responsible for bringing in tons of heroin from Asia, and a bunch of that ended up in our communities with our people being addicted. It was part of the chemical warfare that was being waged against us. Okay, there's a brilliant piece written by one of our national coordinators, BAP's national coordinators, Erica Keynes, where she talks about how crime is used as a Trojan horse for the bourgeoisie. And I can't remember the exact title of it, but I would Erica Keynes, Caines, to for people to take a look at that because what was Trump saying in terms of his rationale for the migration crisis that Venezuela and all these countries were bringing in all these criminals and all of this kind of crap, about the crime. And so they've used that crime issue against us. They use it. They're using it now to empower this new Gestapo. They're using the issue of drugs and crime to give a veneer of respectability and rationale for an imperialist gangster grab of Venezuelan oil. So we don't even take this stuff seriously. We don't even really entertain it in details. We analyze it, we lay out, and we show people how these things were used in the past, and hope that people don't get hung up and engaging the enemy in discussions in their own terms.
Well, comrade, it's always a great pleasure to talk to you, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do so today. And I look forward to our next discussion.
Same here. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk for a little while.
Thank you. And we're signing off today on December 1st, 2025 for Reason to Resist.